Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Get Ready for Game Night, my YouTube channel where I try to teach you some of my favorite board games in a casual, unscripted way, just as though you're sitting down at the table with me right here, right now. Today I'm going to teach you how to play the Expanse Board Game by Jeff Enkelstein and WizKids Games. So let's get ready for game night. The Expanse board game is based on the television show called The Expanse. I believe it airs on the Sci-Fi Network, at least here in the United States. But you absolutely do not have to be a fan of the show to enjoy this game. Ultimately, this is a strategy game set in the relatively distant future where we are each controlling one of 4 different factions trying to gain the most influence or control points, as they're called in this game, by the end of the game. Whoever has the most control points at the end of the game will be declared the winner. And you're going to get control points through lots of different ways, but mostly by having these influence cubes in different sectors of the space and board and all kinds of stuff. But we'll get into that. Before I get too far into the tutorial, I do want to say what you see here are the ships that come with the game. They're just little cardboard tokens. I thought that was kind of boring, so I upgraded them with some plastic ships that I got out of my copy of Eclipse. But if you do buy the game, then these will be the ships that you'll play with. These are the event cards that are used in the game, and they really drive the entire game. And which cards you use and how many you use is determined by the number of players. In a 4-player game, you use the entire deck. No big deal. But for a 2- or 3-player game, you do have to pull out certain cards. And here's how that works. First, regardless of the number of players, you're going to take the 6 score cards that look like this and set them aside. Then, you're going to have to look at the cards and notice that there's a symbol on the bottom left. At least most of the cards have that symbol. If you see the 2-player symbol, that means that card is used in a 2-player game. And the same holds true. The 3-player symbol right here are cards that are used in a 3-player game. So this card would be used in a 2- and a 3-player game. This card, however, would only be used in a 3-player game because there is no 2-player symbol right here. And you'd have to go through the entire deck pulling out the cards that are not appropriate for your number of players. After you've created your deck, you then have to seed the deck with these score cards. And that is going to be different depending on your number of players. In a 3- and 4-player game, you would take 5 cards out randomly, and then take the rest of the deck and divide it into 3 equal piles. You would then take 2 of these score cards and shuffle them into each of the 3 larger piles, put them face down, and put these 5 cards that you took from the beginning on top of those 3 stacks. In a 2-player game, the only difference is there is no 5-card stack to begin. You would simply create 3 equally sized piles and shuffle 2 score cards, face down of course, into each of the piles. After creating and seeding the deck, you would then take the first 5 cards and reveal them in these 5 spaces along the side of the board. The rest of the deck should be set somewhere nearby because you're going to be drawing from it for the rest of the game. Before we go into the rest of setup, I have to explain a little bit how to interpret this map. Throughout the map, you will see various areas that have these little squares in them. Each one of these little squares is considered a base. So for example, the Mariner Valley base is located right here, or the Thoth base is located right here. Each base is contained within an orbital. So Mariner Valley and Londres Nova are in the Mars orbital. And Thoth base is in the Thoth orbital. It happens to be the only base in this orbital. If we look out here, the Saturn orbital has 3 bases in it. So that's how bases and orbitals work. What gets a little bit more confusing is the concept of sectors and bands. Now in the inner part of the solar system, the inner planets and the belt, they're the same thing. you have the inner planets sector and the belt sector, and each one of these sectors is one band width. The outer planets, however, you'll see have this thick purple line running through the middle, which means the outer planets as a sector is composed of two separate bands. One band that contains Jupiter and an outer band that contains Saturn. That becomes important for the purposes of movement later on. Now each player will have to choose which faction they want to play in the game between the United Nations, the Martian Congressional Republic, the Outer Planetary Alliance, or the Protogen Corporation. The rules specifically say that in a two-player game you have to play with the United Nations and the MCR. And in a three-player game you add the OPA. And you only involve the Protogen in a four-player game. However, the designer of the game, Jeff Engelstein, did post on Board Game Geek an Excel spreadsheet that tells you which cards to swap out of the event deck if, for example, you want to play a three-player game using everyone but Mars. So if you go to Board Game Geek and go to this game's site, you can find this spreadsheet that Jeff Engelstein put up there that tells you how to create a deck that is balanced for every combination of factions you want to play with in the game. Once everyone has selected their faction, if they flip their faction card over, it will tell them what their starting components are, where their fleets and influence will start on the board. So let's magically make that happen. And here's the game all set up for 4 players. Now, in addition to each player putting their appropriate fleets in their specified starting orbitals and influence cubes on the specified starting bases, you also have to determine a player order, usually randomly, and put their player tokens here in reverse player order. So here I've set it up that the United Nations is the first player, the Mars is second, OPA is the third player, and Protogen is going last. Therefore, their player token goes at the number 1 slot at initiative. In addition to that, whoever is going last also gains control of one additional fleet token or ship, and that is called the Rocinante. And the Rocinante is sort of a wild card ship that flies around, and their alliances shift depending on the needs. So whoever is the last player in the first round begins the game controlling the Rocinante, and that will go in their home system. And you can tell what everyone's home system is. If you look on the player board, the last action that is available to you is it says build a fleet in, and then it'll give a particular orbital. Whatever orbital that refers to, that's where you will place the Rocinante if you start the game controlling it. After every player has put their starting fleets and influence on the board, they will put their remaining influence cubes on their player board, as well as collect their 3 technology cards and have them nearby, face down, they're not active yet, and also 3 of the 4 factions have these additional components that will come into play later in the game. Every single faction has a special technology that is unique to them that they start the game with, printed here. But as the game progresses, more technologies will be unlocked. And when they get unlocked, these extra tokens will come into play. Each player will also have to take one of their influence cubes and put it right here on the 10-point marker of the control point track. But honestly, for the rest of this video, I'm going to call it the victory point track, because really that's what it is. Now, if you're playing with only 2 players, then the setup at the initiative track's a little different. And in fact, you won't put tokens here at all. You'll flip these over, and you'll notice it has the 2-player symbol on the upper left to remind you, and an X, and then various stations throughout the board. In a 2-player game, you would place these X markers on top of the station indicated, because in a 2-player game, these 4 stations are out of play and don't have any role. The last thing you have to do in terms of setting up the game is locate these bonus sector tiles On one side they all say bonus sector, and on the back side there are 2 copies each of each of the 3 sectors, inner planets, belt, and outer planets. Keep these face down so no one can read them, and just have them on hand, usually right up here in the scoring box. So most of this game is all about trying to get your influence cubes in the various space stations throughout the map, because having the most amount of influence in a space station will allow you to score that station. Now, there are either 5 or 6 scoring rounds in the game, depending on how the deck got shuffled at the beginning. So you're not exactly sure when the game is going to end, but you do know for certain that at least 5 times during the game, you will look at every single station and determine who has the most influence there. Whoever has the most influence in a given station will score some points that you'll keep track of with the tracker along the outside of the board, and whoever has the most points during the final scoring phase will win the game. Let's take a close look at the Earth or United Nations player board to talk about 2 things: the structure of a turn, as well as some additional ways that you can score victory points. Every player has the same turn sequence and options printed right here on their player board. The only exception being the very last thing you can do, the orbital in which you can build a fleet, is different for each player. But you're going to select a card from the track that we set up at the beginning of the game, or play a kept event. A kept event is just a card you selected earlier but opted not to play right away. If you select a new card, you're then either going to use the action points on that card or the event printed on it. And if you use the action points, then your opponents get to do the event that's triggered on it. This is very similar to Twilight Struggle, and I've heard that the designer used Twilight Struggle as an influence on this game. Finally, if you choose to keep that event card, you can, but it does cost you 1 CP or victory point. Now, let's look over here in the upper right. Every player also has these weird symbols on the upper right of their player board. And in fact, those same symbols can be found in every single station on the board. There's 4 of them, and they represent resources that can be controlled if you control that station. And the green represents food, the blue is water, the purple is tech, and the brown is minerals. But for purposes of gameplay, if you see these 2 symbols on your player board, that means you will score an additional victory point if a station that you have the most influence in has one of those symbols. So in this case, the United Nations, if they have the most influence in a given station, they'll get the normal victory points. But if that station happens to either provide food or minerals, then they will get an additional victory point for that station. Now, also, you will see what the starting technology is for each player, but we'll cover that a little bit later. I do want you to notice the Mars player's player board, however, has 2 different resource values. And that's because in a 3-player game, they'll score bonuses for these 2 minerals, minerals and water. But in a 4-player game, they'll score extra points for controlling water and technology space stations. And also notice right up here, the little 2-player symbol is blocked out, meaning in a 2-player game, there are no additional points scored for controlling the space stations that give you these resources. So, what does all that mean in terms of selecting a card? Well, in this card array up here, you'll notice that there's cards that we put here at the beginning of the game, and what you will do on your turn is basically select any one of these cards that is available to you. However, you see these big numbers here. That is the cost to you in terms of victory points for taking that card. So the top card is always free, but the next 2 cards will cost you 1 victory point if you want to choose them, and the bottom 2 cards will cost 2. Now don't worry, every time after a card is chosen and events are resolved, all the cards will move up and we'll get a new card replacing it. So these cards slowly work their way up until they're chosen. Now, once you've chosen the card, you have a choice. You can either activate that card for the number of action points that is printed up here in the upper right. In this case, this card is worth 2 action points. Or you can do whatever the card says on the bottom half of the card. But there's a caveat. You can only do the bottom half of the card if your faction's symbol appears right here in this row. So this card could be activated for its bottom half ability if the player activating it is either Mars, the United Nations, or the OPA. The Protogen player could not activate this card for its bottom half effect, but they could activate it for its action points. As I said, after the card is chosen and you do whatever you're doing, all the remaining cards will slide up, and you will draw a new card off the top of the draw deck to go into the bottom slot. So let's talk about this initiative track. As I said, if the player who's active decides to use the action point allowance on their card chosen instead of using the event, well then every other player gets the opportunity to activate that card for its bottom half event, assuming, of course, their faction symbol is on that card. And the order in which you have the opportunity to activate it is determined by the initiative track. So, let's say that this card was chosen by, I don't know, the United Nations player, and they chose to take the action points. Okay, great. But now, because every other player's faction symbol is on this card, beginning with Protogen, they have the opportunity to activate the bottom half of the card in their favor. And if they say no, then the OPA player gets a chance, and if they say no, then the Martian player gets a chance. The player that actually took the card does not have the opportunity to activate its bottom half if everyone else passes. Well, why wouldn't you do it? Well, as soon as you say, yes, I'm going to activate the bottom half of that card on someone else's turn, well then your initiative token immediately goes to the bottom and everything else gets pushed up. A quick note on order of operations here. If a player selects a card and they elect to use the action points on it, well, they get to spend all 4 of their action points to their completion before the rest of the players have the opportunity to activate the lower half of the card. After the lower half of the card has been activated, then player would proceed to the next player in clockwise order. So let's say you've selected a card and you want to use that card's action points. What can you do with them? Well, it says it right on each player's player board, but let's go over it right now. For 1 action point, you can move a group of fleets 1 band. So what that means is if you have any number of fleets, and remember, each one of these little ship-looking things represents a fleet, including the Rocinante. That is considered a fleet that you own for all purposes. So you could move a group of fleets, so the Protogen player could take all 3 of these fleets, because they control the Rocinante, and move it 1 band. So they could pick up all 3 of these, or they could just pick up 2 and leave 1 behind, or just 1, doesn't matter, and move it 1 band. Or I should say, up to 1 band. Because if you're still in the same band, you could move them up here to Tycho Station. Or you could move them 1 band and go to any orbital in the inner planets. Or they could go 1 band to the Jupiter band and go to any orbital, or basically go to the Jupiter orbital. So that's 1 action point, moving a group of fleets up to 1 band away. You can also travel within the same band to any orbital you want. So if you had 2 action points, you could get 2 bands away with a group of fleets. Another thing you could do is you could place an influence wherever you have a fleet. So the OPA player, for example, because they have a fleet in Vesta, they could drop an influence cube at Vesta Station. That would cost another action point. Finally, what you can do throughout the game, you will have fleets that get destroyed. So let's say that the Protogen player doesn't have any fleets there. For a single action point, they could build a fleet in their home orbital. And those are the three things that you can do with action points. Now, as I said, you can use the action points on the card, or if your faction's symbol is on the card, you can use its printed effect right away. But the other option you have is you can save that card for later. For example, the United Nations player notices that being able to place one influence on two separate food bases might be very good for them, because they score extra points if they have the most influence on food bases. But maybe they don't want to do that quite yet. They want to do it later when it's more advantageous. So another option is, I'm going to say, I want to keep this card for later. And you can do that. But it does say right here, keeping an event card costs 1 CP. So the United Nations player would just keep this card to themselves for use at a later time, but they would have to reduce their victory point value by 1 when they do that. In addition to the advantage of being able to spring that on a future turn, because you can now play this card when it's your turn instead of selecting a card from the array, it's always good to have at least one card that is held, because whenever you get to a scoring round, before scoring happens, you will have the opportunity to play one kept card. So let's talk about scoring right now. If a player selects a card, and after everything is resolved, when we refill the card row, the next card that comes up may be a score card. Nothing happens right away. However, now, whenever there's a score card in the array, on a player's turn, instead of doing the normal thing that we just outlined, they can choose to activate a scoring round. And the same rules apply. Right now, if a player wanted to activate a scoring round, it would cost them 2 victory points. But eventually, this card will make its way up the array, and at some point, it's just going to be too juicy to resist. Someone is going to pick up that card and say, all right, we're done moving ships and influence around, let's score. And now we'll take a closer look at exactly how you score. Let's say someone just picked up a score card. Well, it's really easy, because all you have to do is look on the scorecard and it tells you exactly what happens. First, the active player is going to collect all of these bonus sectors into their hand and pick one of them to put, again, face down right here, where the first scoring marker is available. Then every player in turn order has the option to either play one of their kept event cards, this is why it's important to almost always have one on hand, or if they control the Rocinante, they can activate one of the 4 available actions that the Rocinante has. After they've all done that, then the bonus sector that the person that activated it chosen is going to be revealed. In this case, the inner planets. So what happens? Well, you're going to go around from base to base, space station to space station, and determine who has the most influence in each base. Whichever faction has the most influence in each base, with normal scoring, first place will score 1 point, and then 0 and 0 for second and third place. However, whichever sector is determined to be the bonus sector, whoever's in first place will score 2 points the first time a scoring round occurs, and second place will get 1, third place will get 0, and then this stays here the rest of the game. And there's only 2 of each sector to choose from. So as you can see, later on in the game, as more and more scoring happens, in this round, whoever has the most will get 4 points, second place gets 2, third place gets 1. Now, If there's a tie for first place, then both tied players score the second place points. And if there's a tie for second place, then both tied players score the third place points. And if there's a tie for third place, then neither of those players score. And you will go around from station to station scoring that way. But whoever has the most influence isn't as simple as counting cubes. So let's take a look at that. When you go to evaluate who has the most influence in a given station, you start by counting cubes. But there is something called orbital dominance. If a player has at least one cube in a station and they have the most amount of fleets orbiting that station, then that is considered orbital dominance and gives that player a +1 to their influence. Let's take a look at this example. Tycho Station has one white and one blue influence. However, the blue player, the United Nations, has orbital dominance. So their total influence at Tycho Station is 2. Therefore, the blue player has the most amount of influence at Tycho Station right now. Here, in Vesta, only the white player, the OPA, has any amount of influence. Therefore, even if the blue player had orbital dominance, they don't get a +1 because you have to have at least one influence to get a +1 from orbital dominance. In this case, in Ceres Station, both Mars and the OPA, the orange and the white player, have one influence. Now, the Martian player does not have orbital dominance because they do not have the most amount of fleets in this area. Therefore, they do not get the +1, even though the OPA player doesn't have any fleets. I mentioned that during a scoring phase, every player gets an opportunity to either activate a held event or activate the Rocinante. Well, if you happen to control the Rocinante, in addition for that ship counting as one of your fleets, let's take a look at what you can do with it during a scoring phase. You can activate one of the 4 crew members of the Rocinante. James Holden will let you put one influence anywhere on the map, and this happens before scoring. Naomi Nagata lets you move the Rocinante one band and remove one opposing fleet there. So that would be a great way to, say, get orbital dominance somewhere that your opponents maybe didn't think you could have. Alex Kamal can move the Rocinante to any orbital. Again, that's a way to get all the way across the map, but you don't get to blow anybody up in the process. And Amos Burton, you can remove one opposing fleet in the Rocinate's orbital for each friendly fleet that's already there, including the Rocinante. So you don't get to move, but if you're with a bunch of friends, you get to blow up a lot of people. After every base is scored, every single player will get to unlock a new faction tech or special ability to add to the technology that everyone starts with. Everyone will consult their 3 technology cards, flip them over, and find the one with the lowest Roman numeral value that is still uncovered or not activated yet. So the first time everyone scores, they'll do number 1. The second time everyone scores, number 2 will get unlocked. And the third time a scoring card is chosen, the third and final special ability will be unlocked for the game. Also, after a scoring event happens, everyone has the ability to build one fleet for free in their home base. So, if you have a fleet on your player board, because it was destroyed earlier on, then you could put it back in your home orbital. The last thing you have to do after a scoring round is over is determine Rocinante control. And basically, you just look at the scoring track, and whoever is in last place immediately gains control of the Rocinante. Now, I mentioned earlier that there'll be either 5 or 6 scoring rounds depending on how things play out. And here's why. As soon as the 6th scorecard is revealed, even if the 5th scorecard has not been chosen yet, as soon as someone takes a 6th scorecard off the top of the deck and it gets revealed, the game will now immediately end. So this 5th scoring round will have been skipped because as soon as the 6th one comes out, you do a final scoring and determine a winner. Now in final scoring, things are a little different because there is no bonus sector scoring. For the final scoring round of the game, every single station will score with these point values here. 5 points for first, 3 for second, and 1 for third, plus the additional victory point if you happen to have the most influence in a station that has your particular resource that you're trying to get at. And after you've done that final scoring, you'll just determine a winner. Now that you know the rules to the game, let's talk about every player can break them. I'm going to go over the technologies that everyone has so you can make a little bit more informed choice when determining which faction you want to play. The United Nations, from the beginning of the game, is able to purchase either the first or the second action card slot at 0 victory point cost, whereas normally taking the second card slot costs 1 extra victory point. And in fact, there is a United Nations symbol on that second card slot on the board to remind you the United Nations player does not have to pay a victory point to take this card. The Martian player gets to start the game with battleships. That's in my upgraded components. I use these to represent battleships. In the base game, they look like this. These are basically 2 hit point ships. So if any event in the game says to remove an opposing player's fleet, if it happens to be a Martian player's battleship, instead of removing it, you would flip it to its 1 point side, and then it would take a second action in the game to get it out of there. But when a Martian player wants to build a ship or a fleet, and it's down here because it was destroyed earlier, it only costs them the normal 1 action point to bring it back out. Also, the Martian player has the ability to flip a damaged ship back up to full strength at the cost of 1 action point. The OPA player can spend 1 action point to place an influence on any belt or outer planet base. They do not need a fleet there, but you can only do that once per turn. So the OPA player has a lot of influence as long as you're away from the inner planets of Earth and Mars. And finally, the Protogen player, they can pay 0 to keep an event instead of the normal cost of 1 victory point for a saved event card. So that's how everyone starts. And as I said, everyone has these 3 other technologies that get unlocked during the first 3 scoring phases. I will say that everyone has the second technology being identical, which is open warfare. You may spend 2 action points to remove a fleet where you have a fleet. So after the second scoring round occurs, a lot more space battles will happen because now everyone has this ability. Everyone's first level and third level technology are a little bit different. I'll let you guys discover those on your own. So there you go, everybody. That should be everything you need to know to play the Expanse board game. If I made any mistakes or goofs, please let me know in the comments. Feel free to like and subscribe. Tell your friends. That does motivate me to make more of these videos when I have the time. Or if you have any requests, hey, shoot them my way, either in the Google comments or on Board Game Geek. And yeah, so see you next time on Get Ready for Game Night.